and share screen. Okay, so I'm going to minimize this. Okay, so today we're going to talk about how you incorporate risk into this analysis. And in general, for an economist, this is pretty important, mostly because things vary. Nothing is totally predictable. So that's kind of one of our problems. But first off, we have to have very clear definitions. Most of us look to the future and see a lot of uncertainty. And when you're dealing with uncertainty, you really don't know what the outcome is actually going to be for sure. You have no kind of notion. I mean, you know it's going to be different, or you don't know it's going to be different, but there's a lot of things that you have no predictability on. But in this class, we're mostly going to be dealing with risk because risk has certain probabilities associated with the various outcomes. And if we have that, then we can actually do some computations to figure out what's the best option. So that's really what we're talking about in general. And frankly, if I was really going to spend a lot of time on this class, we would actually buy some add-ons for your Excel so we could actually do this, because you can do some very interesting things that we're going to talk about today if you have those add-ons. And it's kind of much easier actually if you have the add-ons, particularly for people that have large databases of information, so they can pull out information about how things vary over time. And for economists, this is very important because we tend to look at the future based on what happened in the past. We're super big on secondary data. Not a lot of economists do experimental stuff. Mostly that's in the consumer realm. So most of us use large databases. And when you're doing that, then risk is something that you can figure out because you can use these add-ons to assess risk, which is basically an effort to come up with a probability. So another reason we're talking about this is you really want to look at the responsiveness of the NPV or the IRR to variations, because again, nothing happens with certainty. So if you can do some assessment on risk, it helps you understand exactly what's going to happen to that NPV or IRR should things not go like you expect. And this is really a problem that a lot of people encounter. I can remember when I was working with a lot of farmers, I would ask the bankers what their biggest issue is, and they would mention two things. Number one is everybody is over optimistic. They always go for what they think is the most glowing thing to happen. So when we're actually doing business and working with governments and nonprofits, I think we have to control our tendency, because most of us want to be optimistic. Good entrepreneurs are optimistic, but there's a time and place for everything. So when one is looking at these sort of financial decisions, one doesn't want to be too optimistic. One really wants to be what we think of as pessimistic, and most pessimists are actually realists. So that's really what we're trying to bring home with this. This is not an emotional thing. You're just looking at these numbers. And if it doesn't work out like you want to know how in peril things are before you go make a decision that could cost your family home or something. Let's not be doing that. So again, this idea that we really want to look at what are the possible outcomes and can we really live with those? And that's really one of the reasons we do also sensitivity analysis, because we want to see the variations that we may see in the answers. In general, when you're doing sensitivity analysis, you're changing the variable over a range of values. And I generally go best guess, high and low. if I have no other real data, that's what I'll do. And there's actually a program that I've used a lot in my community economic development thing called AHP or ANP, where you actually kind of ask people their assessment of these ranges. And if you interview experts as a group, you can usually get them to kind of converge on things and actually give you these kind of guesstimates of what's going to happen, you know, what's the most likely thing to happen, what's the worst thing that could happen, what's the best thing that can happen. Sati has shown, and I think he worked actually with the military even, to prove that if you query people, then usually if there's experts, you can get them to kind of agree on an assessment. So that's very useful because you can use that to then calculate the NPV or IRR for each option and then get an understanding of how the thing varies. So very useful. So in essence, we're doing something which you probably never thought you would do, is called risk modeling. And we have kind of 3 different sort of ways we can do this. It really depends on the data. And again, you're really looking for variables like prices or quantities or costs that change and are not perfectly predictable. Often costs are a little bit more predictable than what happens on the benefit end, because costs, generally you can call people up, you can get an idea of what inflation rates are, you can talk to vendors, you can get an idea of what next year's stuff is going to look like. And so that's a little bit easier to kind of anticipate what those are going to be, but benefits are kind of another story. So the first option is you have discrete probability distributions. That means you have probabilities and you know exactly what they are. You have estimates of what they are. And so in my case, I'm usually talking about the high option, the most likely option, and the low option. So that would be 3 different discrete distributions for those 3 options. And they would all, those probabilities would all add to 100. The next is a joint probability distribution. And again, those are situations where things vary together, or costs vary and benefits vary. So you have to kind of take this all into account. You can still do those expected values. So it looks a lot like a discrete probability distribution, but it's a lot more work because there's a lot more combinations of the highs and the highs and the lows and the lows and the mediums and the highs and all these things. So it's just a lot more work to calculate it. And then there's kind of like these uncorrelated things where you have all possible combinations to calculate the expected value on the joint probability distributions. So sometimes they're correlated, which means they're related and they move together. But the uncorrelated, then you have to do more combinations. So let's just kind of look at a discrete distribution. And we're assuming here that only costs have a discrete distribution. So only costs will change with these probabilities. And you see that the low has a 20% chance of happening. The best guess is a 60 and the high is a 20. So what we've got to do is calculate the total expected costs. So it's this column right here. And all you have to do is multiply the cost times the probability, and you will get 10. 50 times 0.2, 100 times 0.6, you'll get 60. 125 times 0.2, you get 25. So the total expected costs are going to be 95. And the net NPV for each of these options, they actually give you in the problem. So we have, for the low option, you'll have an NPV of 86. For the best guess, it'll be 32. And for the high, it'll be 11. Why are those changing? Because the costs are changing, right? So if you add those up, then you get net benefits exclusive of cost, then you would get $136 in net benefits. But the problem is that you can't do that because you have these probabilities. You're not going to get 86 all the time. You're only going to get 86 20% of the time. So you have to multiply the 86 by the probability that you'll get 86. And then you have to multiply this 36 by the probability you'll get 36.6. Then you have to multiply the 11 times the probability that you will get that, which will be 0.2. So if you look at this thing, you will have an expected NPV of 41. So it's going to come out right about in here between the 86 and the 36. And why is that? Because 20% of the time, it's only going to be, 20% of the time, it's only going to be $11. So that's pretty low, right? So that's going to bring it down. Only 20% of the time will it be 86. So that's how you find an expected value. You multiply whatever it is, either the cost right here or the NPV right here, times that probability. And if you add them all up, just like here, the probability times the NPV, probability times the expected, times the NPV, probability times the NPV of that option, you're going to come out with overall, if you did this 100 times, ran this thing 100 times, you would end up with $41. That's what you're really thinking this thing is worth. So again, there is a distribution around it, but we've couched the distribution into that expected value. So that might impact it, the decision. And this is a pretty easy one because, again, we only had one discrete distribution that was in cost. If we had more, if they're not correlated and have a joint probability distribution, so this is the worst one of the two joint probability distributions. Let's say that you had a probability that cost would be 50 and benefit would be 70. 60% probability that cost would be 100, benefit would be 125. 20% probability that cost would be 125 and benefit would be 205. The problem with this is then we have to do every combination because you could have a low cost with a high benefit. You could have a low benefit with a high cost. So we have to actually go through and calculate each of these joint probabilities. So here's the combinations. And then here's the associated joint probabilities. So 0.2% of the time it's a low cost times 0.2% of the time it's a high benefit, gives you a 0.04 that you're going to end up with this 155 net benefit. Because if you look at that, the net benefit would be a low cost. Low cost is 50. High benefit is 205, and that's where they get the 155. If the cost is 50 and the benefit is 205, then it gives you a net benefit of 155 times the probability of that occurring. And that's how you do the expected NPV. You go through each of these combinations, the probability of the first one occurring, times the probability of the second one occurring, gives you the joint probability, and then you multiply that joint probability by the net benefit that you've gotten from here. It was a low cost and a medium benefit, I believe. So it's 125 minus 50. And you get a 75, and that's going to happen 12% of the time. So 12% of the time, you're going to get 75, and that equates to 9, a contribution of 9 in the overall estimate of what you're going to expect. So if you run this thing, you're going to get $42.20 as the expected NPV. If you did this 100 times, this is what you would expect. If you ran this thing 100 times and you drew, using these probabilities, a cost of 50, a benefit of 125, 60% of the time, and you did all these combinations, this is what you would expect. So you don't have to do it 100 times. All you got to do is multiply by those probabilities. And that's what gives you the expected net present value. So that's often what people do if they're not very sophisticated, because it's the easiest thing to do. And literally what I do is I ask experts, what do you give me a probability? That's what I do. It's not the most accurate, but it's useful if the client has no idea and we have no data from history about how these variables changed over time. If you had data, then you would do something else. Time series data. Okay. And if you had time series data, then you could actually construct a probability distribution. And anybody who's taken statistics knows that most statistics is really under this kind of notion that it's normally distributed. Problem is, a lot of things are not normally distributed, and we just think they are. If I have ever seen my grades being normally distributed, I would fall over. I have never seen a bell curve on my grades, even though they try to tell you, oh, number of F's equal number of A's, they're normally distributed. I have never in my life given a lot of D's and F's. I just don't like to give them. Students don't like to get them. So this idea that we have this normal bell curve distribution over grades where C is an average, I just think that's false. And I don't know why we keep perpetrating that myth. I just think it's just crazy. Most students would not want to be average. Most students don't want to C. And I keep telling them, well, if everybody got above a C, then I guess the average has gone up. And I think that's what we've discovered when we analyze grades, that averages have gone up. Now, they may be normally distributed between A, B, C, or if you're in graduate school, an A and a B, because in graduate schools, a C is like an F. So they squish the distribution. I'm not sure why they do all this, but we have issues with our assumptions that things are normally distributed when they're not. So we got to knock that off. And then we have our risk modeling programs that will actually look at data and tell you what distribution it most likely has. Or you can actually try to best fit it with a best fit software. So risk, a modeling program like risk, is going to just try and fit it to an existing structure. But best fit will actually emulate the distribution for you and will actually allow you to pull from that distribution and plug in all those different ranges and do several runs to see what that expected net present value. Remember me saying that, oh, yes, we can actually do 100 runs, and I can tell you after 100 times, we should end up with this expected net present value as what we ended up with. If we ran this 100 times, this is what we would end up with. Well, it's the same sort of thing when you use this software. You can actually get a distribution and then you can link it to Excel and say, okay, run it 1,000 times with this distribution and tell me what I'm going to expect over 1,000 runs. That's called Monte Carlo simulation, because you're just pulling a probability and running it through. And why is it called Monte Carlo? Because when you go gambling, I don't gamble, but those of you who gamble, is the house in your favor? I mean, is the probability that you're going to win, is that out there? No, the odds are in favor of the house. That's why they're a business and you're coming in there. And so on the whole, you're going to expect to lose. But once in a while, you will have someone who comes away a winner. My sister always does this. She always wins. She always gambles. She always wins. I never gamble because I'm like, why? I'm going to lose. It's not in the favor of the house. It's in the favor of the house, not in the favor of the customer. So I know I'm going to lose. So what they do is they actually simulate, and the house can tell you what the odds are that they're going to win, what the chances are. And at the end of the night, they're going to have an expectation they made X amount of money. And if someone is consistently winning, they're going to check them out to make sure they're not cheating or that they're somehow affecting the odds, because they're all running off odds. And that's why it's called a Monte Carlo simulation, is because it will hook up to your Excel. You can do a Monte Carlo simulation in Excel if you have your distributions. It's an add-on extension that you have to add to your Excel package, and it will pull from a distribution. Unfortunately, the distribution that it has will probably be something that you will have to insert if it's not normal. So that's why you need a program like Risk, which will allow you to pick a distribution that's most similar to what you have, or you can actually investigate your distribution and try to simulate it yourself using something like Best Fit or another set of software that looks at a data set, pulls a distribution, you push this distribution into your Excel, you come out with your expected NPV based on that distribution. And of course, often this triangular distribution, high, low, best guess, is used. And you assign each of those probabilities so they equal 1. This is where they're saying the 0 to 1 scale. They all add up to 1, high, low, and best, all add up to 1. So you only have 3 options. And in that case, you don't need a Monte Carlo, but it will be less accurate if you're running off a large database. If you have a large database, you should go ahead and estimate what the variation is. Well, mostly because people find it very intriguing when you do these kind of large data analysis things. And Monte Carlo simulation sounds kind of exciting. And you can actually graph how many times you actually, NPV was positive, NPV was negative, and then do interactions between 2 different distributions and come up with a 3rd distribution. Very interesting things you can do if you're into data mining. So it's very useful. So you could then look at sensitivity over a long period of time for more than one variable, and it's very difficult to do this manually. We would be here forever. So if you can do this Monte Carlo analysis, then it really confirms to the user that you've considered all your data points. Because if you do high, low, and best guess, you're not really considering all your data points. So you may be losing information in not looking at the way these things are distributed. That's very important. And particularly if you know how to use these, they're not that difficult to use and they plug into Excel. So it's really interesting. And then what they do is they do a random pull from the distribution, and then they calculate the NPV. And you keep going. So you usually go 1,000 times, maybe 3,000 times. But I think it's very interesting to point out for those of us in the room that are ecologists, because we are in NREM. You know, I thought economists were masochistics. Ecologists are much more masochistic than economists. They have to ground truth. So they will often go with these sorts of things where they want to do the Monte Carlo simulation, where they want to go out 1,000 runs, to make sure that the data doesn't blow up somehow, because somehow they have so many distributions in there that it just isn't realistic at the end of 30 years. Because often if you're working with them, they will go out 30 years, particularly for population models. That's normally when I'm working with ecologists. They really like to beat it with a stick to make sure that that answer is investigated fully and we clearly understand the effect of the distribution across the variables that we're using very well. So this is something that for the ecologists might prove very interesting, because this ability to kind of pull from a distribution is very, very useful because you can plug it into Excel and move it through and do a simulation where you're doing 1,000 runs just to make sure your model doesn't blow up or you get something that's just absolutely unacceptable. And so that's very helpful because it will print out the answer for each run and you will see how it varies, or you can graph it on the program. So very interesting. And I just have to say, for ecologists, they just love to do this. I was shocked when I started working with them. So for those of you who are ecologists, this is very important. And this adds a lot to a model if you're able to actually investigate all these distributions. So here's kind of what you might see with the distribution. Let's see that you may have you notice this B distribution, it has a higher mean, but the probability that you're going to get a 0 or less exists. With this one, it does not. So we see that we might have, this is what we're saying, first degree stochastic dominance is one mean, B, is higher than the mean of A. Here's the mean, right here. Okay, so clearly B has a higher mean than A. It's true. Then we can go to standard deviations, and B probably also has a higher standard deviation, but it's not really normally distributed, so standard deviation may not be the variable that we want to describe, but it certainly varies more. So because it varies more, you really can't say that B is always and forever better than A, because you may end up over here. And how bad is over here? Well, we don't know till we calculate that expected NPV, because we have an over here, but we also have an over here. And I'm just going to honestly tell you that people are very risk averse in general. Most of us, the thought of losing terrifies us. Do you have a losing phobia? A lot of people have losing phobias. I don't want to lose anything. I don't want to risk what I have. So they get a little opposed to losing anything. And because of this, a lot of us don't take risks that might seem kind of normal. If you could look at 1,000 runs and see, oh, most of the time I win. And if I sit here long enough, I will come out ahead. I just need to play more. Right? If I just keep playing and the odds are really in my favor because I've done this Monte Carlo and I can see if I do it 1,000 times, I'm going to come out ahead. So you will start to get a feel for this, and you will see people that do more calculated risks. And this is what we need in our decision makers. There's always a chance we're going to lose. We know this, but what we need to do is make educated risks and weigh the risks and not risk too much. So actually, when I'm doing screening of people to see if they're entrepreneurs, we'll actually do a basketball toss. Well, I'll ask them to stand somewhere and take 3 shots. We give some practice shots and they have to stand in one spot and take 3 shots. If you're an entrepreneurial personality, you're going to make 1 to 2 shots. You're not going to make all 3 shots. If you're really risk averse, and I call that the teenage girl model, you'll stand right next to the basket and pump in all 3 shots. You'll feel great about yourself. And I will say to them, wow, you are really afraid to risk anything. You really need to understand the risk. So we really need to understand what's the NPV we're expecting down in the tail of B. What is that big loss? And that's why we like these simulation models where they run Monte Carlo, so we can see how big that loss could potentially be over 1,000 runs or 3,000 runs. And hopefully they'll think a little bit more rationally. And then on the other end of the spectrum with the basketball toss, you have the teenage boy who sets themselves up for failure. They'll come in, they'll showboat, they'll no way chance to make the basket, but it's all about the show. So why are they setting themselves up with too much risk that they might fail? Again, what is risk? These different probabilities associated with each of these different outcomes. So we need to be able to assess them. It's very important. We tend to be very shy of risk. We tend not to want to lose anything. And some of us are maniacs about not wanting to lose anything. You may think some people are risk loving. which maybe they are, but in most cases, they think there is a probability they're going to win. If you're risk loving, it means I'd rather take a risk than take a sure bet. I will always take the risk. And that's not always the case. It really depends on the structure of the risk. What's the probability of losing? And how confident are you that you're not going to lose? And we do know there are professional poker players that are really confident. So they're not necessarily risk loving, but they're not as risk averse as the average person on the street. So that's really what we're starting to talk about at that point, is the customer and how risk averse are they, and how willing are they to risk taking losses. And this is something, if you're a consultant, you have to really talk to them about. If you're working with a financial planner, they will really ask you, if you're in the stock market, what do you think about that? For me, for example, I used to be in the stock market a lot. And what I would do is even now I have a little bit of money in the stock market, I just don't look at it for a year. Because if I look at it every month and I see lost that much this month, and then I get all upset, right? But if I only look at it every year, every 2 years, in general, I come across ahead and I don't worry, because I know in my brain, all the data tells me that the stock market on average returns, well, it goes up and down. Before the big crash in 2008, it was around 12% you would make if you put money in the stock market. Then it was down to about 10.5. I think in the Trump years, it recovered a little bit. And now I think we're going to be looking at 3 or 4 years where it's not going to look so good. But if you just keep waiting it out, eventually probabilities will come back and stock makes more money than putting your money in treasury bills that has no risk, or bonds that have less risk. So you just have to trust that the people analyzing the data that's done all these analyses of all these distributions and returns know what they're talking about. And I kind of trust them. But I just need to control my little self, because I just hate losing money. So I just need to prevent myself from realizing I've done it. And it really goes back to these distributions and how I feel about them. So that's one of the issues. I mean, even the real estate market, it used to be 7 years from top to bottom. Like 2008, it was at the bottom. And about 7 years later, which is 2015, it wasn't quite at the top, but Portland, for example, I think topped out in 2017. Denver topped out 2018. So there was probably a year or two when it languished because you couldn't borrow money, but it still looks to be about 7 years top to bottom. So if I know that and I can see what's going on, then I can plan on those distributions because I have data about how the distribution runs. So it's very useful. So in general, people are averse, particularly when it involves a large sum of money. Secondly, when you get more money, you do get something called utility. What is utility? This is something economists make up, and we call it UTILs. Oh, I get more UTILs. We don't know what that is, and we make this all up, but we do understand that you get some sort of unit of satisfaction or well-being from having more money, but again, at a decreasing rate. So you get diminishing marginal returns from wealth. This is why I think we should consider putting more taxes on the wealthy, because they don't get as much satisfaction out of that larger wealth position. So you're really not hurting them that bad, okay? Where at a low level of wealth, that extra dollar just matters so much more. I mean, you can do so much with that extra dollar, and it just makes such a difference when you're poor. And that's really what I think we need to bank on. Even though the rich may complain, the reality is the more and more wealthy you get, you just really don't get that much satisfaction from it. And I think we've seen cases where this has been borne out. it's notorious that wealth does not bring you happiness. Yes, to a certain point when you get up to that comfortable level. So when you get to middle class, I suppose 6 figures or more than that if you have a big family. But once you can meet your basic needs, it really doesn't make you happier. So this is my feeling why we ought to consider taxing the wealthy a little bit more, because it's, you know, they complain about it, but it's really not influencing their well-being that much. So that might lead us to believe that if we actually looked at well-being in our Pareto preferred decisions, then maybe it would make sense to take more from the wealthy, because at the very low levels of income, that extra dollar really, really makes a difference. So I think this is kind of a justification. And also, we have a situation, because people are risk averse, that they will not accept a fair gamble, because it's a gamble. The mere fact that you may lose scares you and it affects your well-being. So this is another problem we have to grapple with in our community, because we have this need to be very able to change, to accept risk that comes along with change. It is true that probably the only person that really, really loves change is a wet baby, but it would be better if we could be more willing to accept the risk that comes along with change, because we're constantly holding on to what we have, thinking, oh, we don't want to change. And I think in this time, we've talked a lot in this class about how we need to kind of change what you're doing and accept some risks of different types of people, different situations, different activities, all these different things that we're going to have to try and do. And one of the main problems we're having is that people are so risk averse that they're just not going for change. So this is another thing that we need to start working on, because you're rejecting fair gambles. I mean, you're looking at gambles and refusing to take them. So we're not making the progress that we need to make. When you're hiring people like yourself because you don't feel comfortable dealing with diversity, when in fact, diversity will enrich the experience, but you're so afraid of that gamble that you won't take it. You want to stay in the comfort zone. So this is one area as an economist that I think we need to do more work, but it's just not that easy. In this class, it's not such an important thing, but I think it's important for sustainability, because think of the wild changes we have to make to be sustainable. Giving up our fossil fuel consumption, population growth, even this travel thing. You know, most college students want to travel when they graduate. Is that something we need to give up? So last thing now, we're going to talk about this utility. So we're going to look at this curve, and this is actually a utility curve. And it shows that as you get more and more wealth, utility does not go up by the same amount. It's increasing, but at a decreasing rate. So you get more utility, but you get less and less the more wealth you have. So this amount of addition to the wealth really was the same amount, right? Same amount as this one, but look at the difference in the utility levels, right? This utility level didn't really go up that much as we got this plus H, but look at how much it went when we took it away. Oh, our utility really dropped. So this is really how we draw this idea of the diminishing returns to wealth. And we know it's diminishing because it's increasing at a decreasing rate. If it was increasing at an increasing rate, it would be bold upward, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. So we're very afraid of loss, but we're not that interested in the win. Okay? And here's the expected utility right here. So we're looking at some probabilities, but we want to, this is our utility curve. So which brings me to the last example, which is a homework question. So you have an opportunity that it's risky. you can get $120 with a probability of 0.4 and $40 with a probability of 0.6. So your utility of wealth function is W to the 1/3. So what's the expected value of that wealth? So again, just like expected NPV, you take the amount of the wealth times the probability it will happen, plus the amount of the wealth times the probability that will happen. And you're going to expect, if you did this thing 100 times, you would expect 72 bucks by the time it's over. So how much expected utility is that? Well, here's our utility function. So we plug it in there and say, how much utility is it? Well, let me just say, you can't have partial utiles. We're measuring utiles. It's a fabrication, but we assume it's in discrete increments. So it goes 1, 2, 3, and we actually have curves that will layer out. Here's utility level 1. Here's the combinations that will give you 1 util. Here's the combination that will give you 2 utils. And when we deal with consumer decisions, this is what we're looking at. I know it seems funny for non-economists, but we try to actually worry about the income effect and the substitution effect using these utility curves. And that's how we actually try to take out the income effect and concentrate on the substitution effect that I talked about last time with the Marshallian and the Hicksian demand curves. So how did we get 8? Well, we took the nearest integer. What is 1/3? Cubed root. So the cubed root, if you have a calculator that does cubed roots, you could do that, but it's going to give you a fraction. So you've got to round to the nearest, down to the nearest integer, rounding down again. And 8, is that right? Yeah. Cubed root is 72. No, I think it's actually, I'm sorry. I think it's supposed to be 4. 4? Anyway, not 8, 4. 4, let me get my calculator. 4 by 4 by 4. No, 2. Yes, 4 by 4 by 4. So my mistake, it's supposed to be a 4. That's from your problem. I got 8 because I was looking at the problem. So I'll fix that to 4. So this should be a 4 because 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. And 5 times 5 times 5 is 125. So the cubed root is 72. It's closest to 4. And what level of utility would give you the same utility? What level of wealth would give you the same utility? 4 times 4 times 4. So if you got $64, you would be at the same utility level as if you got this $72. Exact same utility level. So what is the cost of the risk? The $72 of expected wealth minus the level of wealth that would put you at the same level of utility. So the cost of this risk is $8. So you're not willing to pay more than 8, if you really are giving up $8 because you're so paranoid of losing, you're ready to give up $8 because the expected value is $72, but you're not willing to do it because if you don't play at all, you don't do it at all, then you will be at the $64, right? Because you could just keep your money, not play, and you wouldn't lose anything. So the cost of the risk here is $8. So you have a problem that asks about this. And this is how you figure out how risk averse people are. When you go to a financial planner, they'll play some games with you to see how risk averse you are. And then they will find investments that match what you're willing to give up, the cost of the risk that you're willing to bear. Because they'll actually calculate with these distribution programs that I just talked about, what is the potential for loss? What's the potential for gain? So we actually have probabilities and distributions associated with them so that you can actually run through this exact same thing, fit your expected utility function, and that's what would happen. So there we go. And I'm going to end the show. I'm going to stop the share. Okay. So I think there's only a couple problems on that. And I think it's number one, where you calculate this kind of expected NPV using the exact same things that I did for the single distribution or the single discrete variable function. And then the last question, which is the wealth question, and figuring out what is really the cost of risk. And if you have clients and you do these distributions, then you can actually estimate those expected values and talk with them about what they're willing to sacrifice to take those risks. And is it enough? So anyone has questions? Probably not that exciting unless you're into this stuff. But it is what a lot of sophisticated finance people do. And are they calling it financial engineering now, Jordan?
I think I've heard that term before, yes.
Is it a new term? I've not quite figured out what it is, but I think this is kind of what it is, where they really look at how things vary and do they function together, and do they, how can you make portfolios that meet certain target goals based on analysis of these returns, expected returns. I don't know. I've just heard the highest paid person that was hired like 6 years ago at UH was someone in the business school, and they did financial engineering.
Yeah, they had a program, a short-lived program in the College of Business that you could get a master's in financial engineering. But
I think it's a lot of this type of analysis, though.
Yes. Yep.
And again, what's scary about it to me is that you're all basing on historical data, right?
Yeah, and that's not indicative of the future.
And that is the problem if we have change, right? Because as soon as you change, your distributions are blown. All your estimates are blown, right? So this is, economists get very desperate when we don't have this historical data. When I started out, I liked experimental data because I thought it was more exciting. And you could actually investigate consumer preferences because I was super into marketing. But with this financial engineering, I'm afraid and even now we're at a complete conundrum of the interest rates. We have situations where investors won't borrow even though the rates are low. So maybe the whole structural change has happened. So these models will not be effective. And then what do you do? If all you have is your model that predicts and the model structure has broken down because there's a change in the structural way things are proceeding, and I kind of think that's where we're at now. Is it just me? I'm just feeling like there's just so much change going on that we're all very uncertain.
The pandemic has definitely shown and that the market in particular can react in a way that is very much not anticipated. I think part of that was due to some of the drastic measures taken on by our Treasury and Fed and some of the other central banks around the world to infuse capital and change the interest rates and such. And that was not able to be predicted. These are just
people doing this, right? They don't really know what's going to happen. They're just desperate to improve things.
Yeah.
So they do things, and then we're like, oh, now we got to live with that.
Yeah, I'm going to be curious what the long-term impact is going to be, and that's going to need to be factored into the models going forward.
I'm very concerned about the debt. Because remember when Bill Clinton left office, there was no debt. And we felt so good about that. But now, are we concerned about debt? I mean, I'm thinking, oh, if it was me, I just couldn't borrow forever. There's an implication here. Detroit, for example, did go bankrupt. So this happens. So it's very funny. And I kind of think there's a structural change. I think since we came into the 21st century, there's been a lot of structural changes. things are a lot different than they used to be. And I think people are very scared of it because they tend to kind of be comfortable in history and looking forward from history. But so it's going to be a very interesting time, and I have a feeling that that's why this financial engineering thing kind of tanked, because it's just basically big data mining to try and come up with predictions. But if you have structural changes, those things are just going to change, and you're not going to be able to fix them until you get massive more data. And by the time you get massive more data, they might have changed again. So very difficult. It's very difficult, a very challenging time, I think. But it really goes back to risk and how we manage risk, how we live with risk, what we do about it. Of course, in this class, it's pretty straightforward because you just have these little assignments. But in reality, it's difficult, very difficult. And we need to get more change ready. And we also have situations where the poor are getting poorer. So the margin of utility of extra money for them is so huge that I think that is also going to be an issue.
I have a question, Professor, about that concept. I understand that the poor are getting poorer, you know, from this system that we've been in, but how do you state the case as to why that's important, like to policymakers? I mean, it's not that they don't necessarily care, but how does that affect them for the poor to be getting poorer?
Well, I think now we're seeing this come home to roost, right? Demonstration, because one of the ways that you change community is through this abrupt demonstrating and violent change. And I think that's where it's now gonna come home to roost. I think the people in Oregon are really scratching their chins. Like, how did we get in this situation where we have federal agents running around and doing this stuff? And I also think it's a problem for a lot of groups, right? Because you have the older groups that have never really experienced, the baby boomers who've never really experienced this. We grew up, everything was great. I never had to pay tuition. It was like, oh, this is fine. Oh, it's wonderful, right? And then you guys will not be making what your parents will be making because things have changed.
Yeah.
And then incorporating that with trying to get millennials to be able to communicate this concern, because demonstrating is fine, but we also need some path of action, right? So this is why I keep saying, I don't know what we're going to do about this, but this is what we need to be talking about. How do we get Black Lives to Matter? I mean, how do we make that? We can say it, but every day, what do we do? Because they're not going to have self-esteem if you give them, you know, I just don't think it's good to just be condescending and just give them a little token or these sorts of things. I mean, we need to make systemic change. So what does that look like? And then, like you're saying, the problem with politicians is a lot of them are older. They have relationships with people that have influence. They have PACs that contributing money. They don't see a poor person in their office. And when they see a poor person, does that person put forward a reasonable plan with supported information? This is why we need you to do cost-benefit analysis to help them explain how the projects would make the community better. Because it's difficult to explain if you're not a sophisticated individual who can communicate with someone at a legislative level. Because they're frustrated. They may be shy. I know in Hawaii, the self-esteem is a problem. They don't feel comfortable. They don't know what to say. They don't have a solution. I remember when I used to work with displaced sugar workers, they say, ma'am, I just want a job. I've never applied for a job. I just worked for the sugar company and turned left for 24 years. And I work so hard and I will sit and turn left and left and left. And I was like, yeah, it would be nice if I could just give you a job where all you did was stay in your current house and turn left. It's just not going to happen. So how we navigate that, I'm not quite sure. But I think This is why I'm trying to teach CBA, because I feel like at least, or BCA, this at least puts some order on things and allows you to kind of explore some of the costs associated with not helping the poor.
Okay, thanks.
Rioting is expensive.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. And demonstrating, I'm like, you know, this creates a lot of social issues. There's been a lot of death. There's a lot of, I mean, now we don't believe in our police. This is very chaotic and expensive for us. So if you can demonstrate that in your BCA and put some numbers on that, then it's a lot more helpful. I'm not saying it's easy, but at least you can communicate with them. Because most of the time what they're seeing at legislative areas are people that are very well spoken and have very good educations and are talking profits, right? They're not talking about helping the poor. So it's going to be a battle. I'm very concerned about it. And I think every day, like, so what could we actually do to ensure that Black lives do matter? What actions? What would that look like? And what are we going to have to deal with when we try to do that? Because there's a lot of entrenched values and way things are organized that people are not going to want to, you know, they're risk averse. They don't want that change. They don't want those risks.
Well,
they want the sure
also,
bet.
I think that to a lot of people, it's a zero-sum game. Like if someone else's gain means their loss, right? Like if
Yes,
someone
that's
else,
exactly the problem. We all think it's a zero-sum game. So if you can use BCA to show that there are some benefits, like when we talk about being unemployed, oh, then you can't do these other things. Because where do we get the idea that an unemployed person is worthless? I don't know where we get this idea. I don't think they're worthless. They do probably a lot of things. But we have these things in our minds, right? If you're on welfare, that means it's bad. You know, all these values, and we need to stay away from values and talk about issues. If an unemployed person cannot eat and clothe themselves, then that's a problem, I think. Then we have to deal with that. Or medical care. But them being unemployed, again, doesn't mean they're worthless and not contributing. We just need a way to compensate them and get them, you know, moving so that they can, whatever that means, to get what they need: food, clothing, these basic necessities. So I don't really have any answers, but I think it's very intriguing, and I think we're at a really crossroads. I'm trying to wrap my head around the fact the president says he won't accept the election results if he doesn't like them. I think I read that quote. I'm thinking, oh, that's very strange, because I think we have a system. So anyway, we're about out of time, but I think it does give one time to think, and you know, what could businesses do? What could the government do? What could nonprofits do? And how do we ensure their ongoing existence so that their projects are successful? Okay, so there we are. We're done for today because we're out of time.
thank you.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
I'm gonna